Ripping parchment is surprisingly loud in a quiet room. It doesn't sound like defiance. It sounds like a bone snapping. Arthur Pendleton, Duke of Westford, had just slid a fortune, a title, and a marriage contract across his scarred mahogany desk. "Marry me," he commanded, expecting her desperate, immediate compliance. Instead, Beatrice Hale picked up the heavy vellum, her ink-stained, freezing fingers trembling just once, and tore it straight down the middle. Rainwater dripped from the frayed hem of Beatrice's wool coat, pooling on the Duke's priceless Aubusson carpet. She watched the dark stains spread against the pale blue threads, feeling a dull sense of guilt layered over her bone-deep exhaustion. Her boots, stuffed with newspaper to plug the holes in the soles, squeaked faintly as she shifted her weight. Her toes were completely numb. Arthur Pendleton sat behind a desk, large enough to dine a family of 10. He didn't look up immediately. He was writing, the gold nib of his fountain pen scratching a harsh, rhythmic rhythm against heavy paper. The sound grated on Beatrice's nerves, reminding her of rats in the walls of her boarding house. The library smelled of beeswax, old leather, and faintly of expensive tobacco. It was overwhelmingly warm. The hearth fire roared behind an ornate iron grate, kicking out a dry heat that made the damp wool of Beatrice's coat smell like wet dog. She fought the urge to scratch her neck where the cheap, coarse collar chafed against her skin. "Sit down, Miss Hale," Arthur finally said. He did not gesture to a chair. He did not raise his eyes from his ledger. Beatrice looked at the velvet-upholstered wingback chair opposite him. She didn't sit. She was afraid if she sank into that plush velvet, she would simply fall asleep and never wake up. Her printing press, her father's press, the one she had ruined her hands and her eyesight trying to save, had been seized by the bank 48 hours ago. She had eaten nothing but half a bruised apple since Tuesday. Her stomach gave a low, humiliating rumble. Arthur's pen stopped. He carefully capped it, aligned it perfectly parallel to his inkwell, and finally looked at her. His eyes were the color of slate roofing right before a winter storm. Flat, unforgiving. He lacked the soft, powdered plumpness of the aristocrats Beatrice usually dealt with when printing their vanity pamphlets. Arthur was sharp angles and immaculate tailoring, his dark hair cut severely, his jaw set as if he were bracing for a blow he knew would never land. "You are bankrupt," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I am temporarily lacking liquidity," Beatrice replied. Her voice cracked. It was a pathetic lie, and the dry rasp of her throat betrayed her. She swallowed hard, tasting brass. Arthur leaned back. The leather of his chair creaked, a wealthy, heavy sound. "The bank has padlocked your premises. Your creditors are preparing to petition for debtor's prison by Friday. You owe precisely £462, 8 shillings and 4pence. Beatrice's fingernails dug into her palms. The exactness of the number felt like a physical slap. She stared at the knot of his silk cravat, refusing to meet those flat slate eyes. "If you brought me here to gloat, Your Grace, you are wasting the coal burning in your fireplace. I am well aware of my ledgers. I do not gloat, I solve problems." Arthur opened a silver box on his desk, retrieved a cigar, and clamped it between his teeth. He didn't light it. He just chewed on the end, studying her like a ledger entry that refused to balance. "You possess an unblemished reputation, despite your working-class dabbling. Your father was a baronet before he drank away the estate. You have no living relatives to interfere, no lingering attachments, and, currently, no options." "I am a printer," she said stubbornly, though the ghost of ink on her cuticles was all she had left of her trade. "You are a beggar in a wet coat," Arthur corrected smoothly. He didn't say it with malice. He said it with the casual cruelty of a man stating the weather. He opened a leather folder resting on his desk. From it, he withdrew a thick sheaf of cream-coloured vellum, bound at the top with a heavy red ribbon. He rotated the document and pushed it across the polished mahogany. It stopped inches from her dripping hands. "Read it if you wish, though the legalities are dense," Arthur said. "I require a wife. Immediately. My uncle's will stipulates I must be married by my 30th birthday to inherit the northern estates. That birthday is in 3 weeks. The women of my circle are complicated. They come with meddling mothers, political demands, and expectations of affection. I have no time for affection. I need a woman who understands a transaction." Beatrice stared down at the paper. The black ink swam before her tired eyes. "The terms are simple," Arthur continued, his voice an even, unbothered baritone. "You will be the Duchess of Westford. You will attend the necessary social functions, smile when required, and manage the household staff. In return, your debts will be erased by noon tomorrow. You will receive an allowance of £5,000 a year. You will have a warm bed, hot food, and you will never face the inside of a debtor's prison. You will live comfortably for the rest of your life." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. £5,000. Her mind, starved and frantic, immediately calculated how many printing presses that could buy. How much paper? How much ink? She could smell roasting meat suddenly, an olfactory hallucination brought on by extreme hunger. All she had to do was say yes. It was a lifeline. It was salvation. But as she looked up at him, she saw the absolute certainty in his posture. He was bored. He had already moved on to the next item on his mental agenda. He wasn't looking at a human being. He was looking at a purchased asset, no different than a prize mare or a new carriage. "Marry me," the Duke commanded. He tapped his finger once against the mahogany. "Sign the bottom, Miss Hale. I have the carriage waiting to take you to my solicitor to finalize the settlements." Beatrice reached out. Her hand hovered over the heavy vellum. The paper was cool to the touch, expensive and thick. She picked it up. Her fingers, scarred from lead type and stained with black ink, looked obscene against the pristine white surface. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach, a violent physical rejection of the moment. She wanted the money. God, she wanted to be warm. But the thought of belonging to this man, of being bought for the exact price of her failure, made bile rise in her throat. Silence thickened in the library, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Beatrice held the contract with both hands. The paper was stiff, resilient. Arthur picked up his pen again, holding it out to her, the gold nib catching the firelight. He expected a nod. He expected a weeping display of gratitude. Beatrice didn't take the pen. She looked down at the precise, elegant script dictating the rest of her life. Party of the first part. Party of the second part. Her knuckles turned white. A strange, vibrating energy seized her forearms. It wasn't a heroic burst of feminist defiance. It was panic, raw and ugly. It was the terrified realization of a cornered animal, realizing the open cage door led straight to an abattoir. If she signed this, Beatrice Hale would die, and a quiet, purchased ghost would take her place. Without breaking eye contact with the Duke, she tightened her grip. Her hands shook, just once. Then she pulled her hands in opposite directions. The heavy vellum resisted for a fraction of a second before giving way. Rip! The sound exploded in the quiet room. It was harsh, jagged, and final. She didn't stop. She stacked the two torn halves together and tore them again. Her breathing was ragged, shallow gasps escaping her chest as she reduced her salvation to confetti. Arthur's face was a study in suspended animation. The pen hovered in the air midway between them. The flat, slate-grey calmness of his eyes shattered, replaced by a shock so profound it looked almost comical. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. For the first time in his meticulously orchestrated life, Arthur Pendleton was utterly, completely speechless. Beatrice let the torn scraps of paper flutter from her hands. They rained down on the polished mahogany, some landing in the crystal inkwell, others drifting to the expensive carpet. Her adrenaline spiked, making her lightheaded. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. "Miss Hale," Arthur finally managed, his voice dropping an octave, raspy with disbelief. "What have you done?" "I am bankrupt, Your Grace," Beatrice said. Her voice shook, no longer from cold, but from the violent crash of adrenaline. "But I'm not for sale, not even to settle a ledger." She didn't wait for him to recover. She turned on her heel, her wet boots slipping dangerously on the slick wool of the rug. She stumbled, catching herself awkwardly against a heavy wooden globe stand. It spun wildly, squeaking on its brass axis. She didn't look back. She practically ran for the heavy double doors of the library, hauling them open with a desperate yank. The hallway outside was vast and cold. Footmen in livery stared as she hurried past them, her damp coat flapping. She pushed through the heavy front doors and spilled out into the freezing London evening. The rain hit her instantly, sharp as needles. She slipped on the top marble step, her knee hitting the stone with a sickening crack. Pain flared up her thigh, forcing a sharp cry from her throat. She scrambled up, her hands scraped and muddy, and limped down the driveway toward the wrought iron gates. She was freezing. Her knee throbbed. She was going to lose her room tomorrow, and by Friday she would likely be in a cell. She had just thrown away £5,000 a year, tears of sheer terror mixed with the rain on her face. She stopped under a flickering gas lamp, leaning heavily against a brick wall, and threw up her bruised apple into the gutter. She wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling, ink-stained hand. She wasn't a hero. She was a fool, a starving, freezing fool. But as she took a shuddering breath, the air filling her lungs was hers. It didn't belong to the Duke of Westford. Back in the stifling warmth of the library, Arthur Pendleton sat perfectly still. He slowly lowered his pen, letting it clatter onto the desktop. He stared at the torn pieces of vellum. The edge of one piece, bearing the severed red ribbon, lay inches from his hand. The scent of her lingered in the room. It was a sharp, biting smell of rain, cheap lye soap, and the metallic tang of printer's ink. It entirely overpowered the rich aroma of his unlit cigar. Arthur picked up a jagged piece of the contract. His thumb brushed over the thick paper. He had offered her everything: safety, wealth, status. Women had plotted, lied, and ruined each other for half of what he had just pushed across this desk. And this half-starved, shivering tradeswoman in a rotting coat had looked at his money, looked at him, and destroyed it, a muscle feathered in his jaw. The utter silence of the room, once a comfort, now felt heavy and accusatory. He looked at the wet stain she had left on his Aubusson rug. It was dark and muddy, an ugly blemish on perfection. Arthur slowly reached for the silver bell on his desk. He rang it once. The sharp chime cut through the stillness. A servant appeared instantly at the door. "Your Grace? Tell my solicitor to cancel his evening appointments," Arthur said quietly, never taking his eyes off the torn paper in his hand. "And have my man fetch my riding coat, the heavy one." "Are we going out in this weather, Your Grace?" the servant asked, hesitant. Arthur crushed the scrap of vellum in his fist. A strange, unfamiliar pressure settled tight in his chest, an irritating mixture of fury, insulted pride, and a dark, sudden fascination. "Yes," Arthur said softly. It seems I have a debt to collect. Cobblestones felt like iron teeth beneath Beatrice's ruined boots. Every step sent a jolt of fire up her leg, originating from the cracked skin of her bruised knee and settling deep in her hip. She dragged her right foot slightly, an ugly, scraping sound that echoed in the narrow alleys. London was actively trying to drown her. The rain had intensified from a sharp drizzle to a relentless, heavy downpour that overwhelmed the gutters, sending streams of black, foul-smelling water rushing over the curbs. She hugged her arms across her chest, but the wool coat was entirely compromised. It clung to her ribs like a wet shroud, heavy and useless against the biting November wind. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the Duke's library was fading fast, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. A carriage rattled past, its iron-banded wheels splashing a wave of freezing mud over her shins. Beatrice didn't even flinch. She just kept walking, her head ducked, her jaw locked so tightly her teeth ached. She concentrated entirely on the mechanics of moving forward. Left foot, right foot. Breathe in the thick, coal-choked fog. Ignore the sharp, stabbing hunger in her belly. She was an idiot, a prideful, starving idiot. The phantom warmth of the Duke's library mocked her. She could still smell the dry, rich heat of his fire and the crisp scent of the vellum contract. £5,000 a year, a warm bed, immunity from the creditors who were currently hunting her like dogs. All she had to do was surrender her autonomy to a man who looked at her with the same emotional engagement he gave his ledgers. Her stomach clamped down in a painful spasm. She stopped, leaning her forehead against the damp brick of a bakery wall. The faint smell of stale yeast and burned sugar drifted through a cracked vent. It was a cruel tease. "Not for sale," she whispered to the empty, rain-slicked street. Her voice was raspy, barely audible over the rush of water. She squeezed her eyes shut. It sounded pathetic now, a hollow victory of pride that would probably cost her life. But when she pictured Arthur Pendleton's flat, slate-grey eyes waiting for her to bend the knee, a stubborn, burning knot of defiance tightened in her chest. She would rather freeze on her own terms than be kept in a gilded cage by a man who didn't even see her as human. Miles behind her, Arthur Pendleton was discovering that he hated the rain. He sat rigidly in the saddle, his heavy riding cloak doing little to stop the icy dampness from creeping down his collar. His massive black gelding tossed its head, annoyed by the weather and the sudden harsh pace its master was demanding. Arthur's gloved hands kept a punishingly tight grip on the reins. He didn't ride out in storms. He paid people to handle unpleasantness. Yet here he was, urging his horse through the worsening slums of the East End, navigating around overflowing cesspools and dodging drunken labourers stumbling out of gin lanes. The scent of the streets was foul, a noxious blend of rotting cabbage, human waste, and wet ash. Arthur breathed it in, his expression fixed in a hard, unreadable line. He was operating on an unfamiliar fuel. Usually his actions were dictated by logic, profit, and the preservation of his family's immense holdings. Tonight he was driven by a dark, stinging irritation. "I am bankrupt, but I am not for sale," her words played on a loop in his mind, scraping against his pride. Women of his class threw themselves at him. They maneuvered, manipulated, and compromised every moral standard they claimed to hold, all for a fraction of his attention. He had offered Beatrice Hale absolute security. He had offered her a dukedom, and she had looked at his wealth like it was a contagious disease, torn his contract into shreds, and walked out into a freezing storm without a second thought. It was an equation that didn't balance. And Arthur Pendleton despised unbalanced ledgers. He turned his horse onto Miller's Court, the address his man of business had provided when investigating Beatrice's failing print shop. The street was incredibly narrow, lined with leaning, dilapidated boarding houses that looked as if they were propping each other up. The gas lamps here were either broken or unlit, leaving the alley in a suffocating gloom. He pulled back on the reins. The gelding stomped, its hooves splashing loudly in a deep puddle. Arthur scanned the doorways. There she was. Beatrice was slumped against the peeling wooden frame of number 14. She was trying to force a brass key into a rusted lock, but her hands were shaking too violently to manage it. Her hat was gone, her dark hair plastered to her skull, and cheeks in wet, unruly strands. Even from a distance, Arthur could see the violent tremors racking her thin frame. He dismounted, the heavy thud of his boots masked by the thunder. He tied the gelding to a rotting hitching post. He didn't call out to her. He just walked, his long strides eating up the distance between them. Beatrice dropped the key. It hit the wooden stoop with a dull clink. She let out a frustrated, broken sound, a quiet sob that was instantly swallowed by the rain. She dropped to her knees to search for it in the dark, her fingers blindly scraping across the splintered wood. Arthur stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked down at her. The mud from the street covered the hem of his pristine trousers, and his expensive wool cloak was heavy with water. He didn't offer to help her look. He reached into his coat, pulling out a heavy, brass-bound leather folder. It was dry, protected by his layers of wool. Beatrice's hand bumped against his boot. She froze. Slowly she looked up. Her face was deathly pale in the dim light, her lips a faint, bruised shade of blue. The rain tracked down her cheeks like continuous tears, washing away the dirt and leaving her looking impossibly young and desperately fragile. But when her eyes met his, the vulnerability vanished, replaced instantly by a sharp, defensive glare. Arthur looked down at her, feeling a strange, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. He ignored it. "You left a mess in my library," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain, smooth and entirely devoid of warmth. Beatrice didn't move. She stayed on her bruised knees on the wet stoop, staring up at the imposing shadow of the Duke of Westford. He blocked the weak light from the street, casting her entirely in darkness. The heat radiating off his large frame was palpable, a cruel contrast to the freezing puddle soaking through her skirts. "Go away," she gritted out. Her jaw was shivering so hard the words were barely coherent. She dropped her gaze, frantically swiping her numb fingers across the wet wood, desperate to find her key and lock a door between them. "You are shivering," Arthur observed. He sounded clinical, like a physician noting symptoms of a terminal disease. "Astute observation, Your Grace. It is raining. I am wet. Now leave." Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the key. She snatched it up, using the doorframe to haul herself upright. Her bad knee protested violently, and she swayed, almost pitching backward down the steps. Arthur's hand shot out. His grip was a vice on her upper arm, steadying her instantly. The leather of his damp riding glove was rough against the thin, wet wool of her sleeve. "Let go of me," she snarled, trying to jerk away. She had no leverage and no strength left. He didn't even budge. "If I let go, you will fall and fracture your skull on the cobblestones," Arthur replied, his tone conversational. "While that would certainly solve your debt crisis, it creates a rather messy problem for me." "I am not your problem," she hissed, pressing her back against the door. "Unfortunately, Miss Hale, you are." Arthur released her arm, stepping back just enough to give her a false sense of space. He held up the brass-bound leather folder. The rain beaded and rolled off the treated leather. I visited a man named Fisk an hour ago. Do you know him? Beatrice felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The cold was instantly replaced by a sickening hot panic that pooled in her stomach. Fisk, the primary holder of her father's gambling debts, the man who had bought the mortgage on her printing press. What did you do? She whispered. I found him at his club, Arthur said smoothly. He is a greedy, unpleasant little man. He smelled of cheap gin and stale sweat. It took precisely 4 minutes to convince him to part with your promissory notes. I bought them all. Beatrice stared at the folder. The reality of his words crashed into her with the force of a physical blow. The air in her lungs evaporated. You! She swallowed hard, tasting bile. You bought my debt. I did. Arthur tapped the folder against his gloved palm. £462, 8 shillings and 4pence. Plus a rather exorbitant convenience fee Fisk insisted upon for the late hour. You no longer owe the bank, Miss Hale, and you no longer owe Mr. Fisk. He leaned in slightly. The smell of wet wool, clean rain, and expensive tobacco surrounded her, suffocating her. You owe me. Beatrice let out a ragged breath. She gripped the doorknob behind her back, her knuckles turning white. She had torn up his contract to save her freedom, only to find he had simply bought the cage and locked the door from the outside. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Why would you do this? I told you no. I tore up your bloody paper. Why can't you just leave me alone? Arthur didn't answer immediately. He looked at her face, the hollowed cheeks, the bruised shadows under her eyes, the sheer, exhausted terror radiating from her tight posture. He felt that irritating tightening in his chest again. It wasn't pity. He didn't do pity. It was something darker, something possessive that he didn't care to examine. I am a man who requires a wife to secure an inheritance, Miss Hale, he said slowly, his voice dropping in volume until it was a low, dangerous rumble. I selected you because you were the most logical candidate. You possessed the correct pedigree and the correct desperation. When you tore up that contract, you introduced an irrational variable into my plans. I am a person, not a variable, Beatrice shot back, anger briefly cutting through her panic. I have the right to refuse you, and I have the right to purchase outstanding debts, Arthur countered smoothly. 'Tis entirely legal. You are bankrupt. You have no home. Your press is locked. By Friday, without my intervention, Fisk would have had you thrown into the Fleet prison. You would not survive a week in the Fleet, Beatrice. It was the first time he had used her given name. It felt invasive, slipping from his mouth with a casual intimacy that made her skin crawl. So you are my savior now, she mocked, a bitter, hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. You bought me to save me? I am not a savior, Arthur said flatly. I am a pragmatist. I require your compliance. I prefer a willing transaction, which is why I offered you the contract first. You rejected the velvet glove, so I am presenting the iron fist. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder. He took the key from her frozen fingers. She was too shocked to fight him. He fitted it into the lock and turned it. The rusted mechanism groaned, and the heavy door pushed open, revealing a dark, narrow hallway that smelled intensely of boiled onions and stale beer. What do you want? Beatrice whispered, shrinking against the doorframe. I want you to pack whatever meagre belongings you have left, Arthur commanded, stepping back and gesturing towards the dark hallway. My carriage is waiting at the end of the street. You are coming to Westford House. And if I refuse, she challenged, lifting her chin, though her whole body was vibrating with cold and fear. Arthur's expression hardened. The slate-grey eyes turned cold as ice. If you refuse, I will walk to the magistrate tomorrow morning and file the papers to have you arrested for unpaid debts. I will watch them haul you into the Fleet, And when you finally realize that pride does not keep you warm or feed your stomach, you will beg me to let you sign a new contract." He paused, letting the harsh reality of his threat settle over her like a heavy blanket. "The choice is entirely yours, Miss Hale. Pack your bags or pack nothing at all. But you are leaving this alley tonight." Defeat did not taste bitter. It tasted like nothing at all. Numbness spread from Beatrice's chest outward, silencing the frantic beating of her heart. She stared down the dark, suffocating hallway of the boarding house. The walls were slick with condensation, smelling of boiled cabbage, damp rot, and human despair. She had fought so hard to keep this miserable patch of floor. Now it was just another thing she was too poor to afford. Without another word, she turned her back on the Duke and limped inside. Arthur followed. His heavy boots sounded like cannon fire on the rotting floorboards. He didn't wait on the stoop. He stepped into the gloom, ducking his head to avoid a low-hanging structural beam. The sheer size of him consumed the cramped space, making the air feel even thinner. "Room 7, she muttered. "Top of the stairs. Don't touch the banister, it splinters." She pulled herself up the narrow staircase. Her knee screamed with every upward thrust. Twice she stumbled. Twice Arthur's hand shot out to hover an inch from her waist, not quite touching her, but ready to catch her. She hated that phantom heat at her back. She hated that she was relying on it. Room 7 was a closet under the eaves. It contained a narrow cot, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a small trunk. The ceiling sloped so severely Arthur had to stand by the door, his shoulders brushing the peeling wallpaper. Beatrice dropped to her knees beside the trunk. She opened it. Inside lay her entire life. 2 threadbare cotton dresses, a woolen shawl moth-eaten at the edges, a tarnished brass comb, a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare, its spine cracked, smelling faintly of her father's pipe smoke. She gathered them haphazardly, stuffing them into a faded canvas satchel. Arthur watched her. His face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, but his eyes tracked her every frantic, jerky movement. He noticed the purple bruises blooming on her wrists. He noticed the way her ribs showed through the wet wool of her coat when she reached for the comb. A profound, uncomfortable tightness clamped around his throat. He was buying a starving woman. It was a brutal fact, stripped of any polite societal veneer. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice low in the small room. "I do not require a vast wardrobe for debtor's prison, Your Grace," she snapped, buckling the satchel with shaking fingers. "This is what I have. Give me the bag. I can carry my own." He didn't argue. He simply reached down, gripped the canvas strap, and pulled it from her hands with a casual strength that made her feel absurdly small. He turned and walked out. Beatrice followed him down the stairs and back out into the freezing deluge. A black carriage with the Pendleton crest emblazoned on the door waited at the mouth of the alley. The driver sat hunched against the rain. A footman, thoroughly soaked, jerked open the door and pulled down the iron steps. Arthur stepped aside. "Get in." She hauled herself up. The interior of the carriage was an entirely different world. It smelled of oiled leather, expensive cedar, and dry warmth. A brass warming pan lay on the floorboard, radiating a luxurious heat that made her shivering, intensify violently as her cold blood began to circulate. She huddled in the far corner, pressing herself against the tufted velvet squabs, trying to take up as little space as possible. Arthur climbed in after her. The carriage dipped under his weight. He slammed the door, shutting out the storm and sealing them in the dark, intimate cabin. He knocked twice on the roof. The carriage lurched forward. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of hooves on wet cobblestones and the rapid, shallow rasp of Beatrice's breathing. She stared at the brass warming pan. Her feet, encased in the ruined boots, ached with a deep, throbbing agony as they thawed. She wanted to press her hands against the metal to absorb the heat, but she refused to move. She wouldn't show him how desperately she needed the comfort he had weaponized. Arthur watched her from the shadows. The carriage rattled over a deep rut, throwing her slightly forward. She caught herself, wincing as her bad knee bumped the opposite seat. "Take off your boots," Arthur ordered. Beatrice stiffened. "No." "Your feet are freezing. The leather is soaked through. Take them off and put your feet on the pan, or you will lose your toes to frostbite." "I prefer to keep them on." Arthur let out a slow, deeply irritated exhale. "Miss Hale, I have purchased your debts. I am transporting you to my home. Do you honestly believe I harbor any untoward intentions toward your wet feet? Remove the boots." She glared at him. The darkness hid the flush of humiliation creeping up her neck. She reached down. Her fingers were stiff, fumbling clumsily with the wet, knotted laces. She pulled, but the leather cord was swollen with water and wouldn't budge. A frustrated sound escaped her throat. Before she could try again, Arthur leaned forward. He dropped to one knee on the carriage floor, ignoring the damp dirt her boots had tracked onto the pristine rug. "Stop!" she panicked, trying to pull her foot back. He caught her ankle. His grip was firm, immovable. Through the wet wool of her stocking, she felt the heat of his bare hand. He had removed his gloves. He efficiently picked apart the swollen knot, his large fingers deft and precise. He pulled the ruined leather boot off and tossed it aside. He repeated the process with the other foot. Underneath, her stockings were full of holes. Her toes were pale, almost translucent in the dim streetlights flashing past the windows. Arthur didn't say a word. He simply lifted her feet and placed them directly onto the flannel-wrapped warming pan. Then he unclasped his heavy, dry riding cloak and threw it over her lap, tucking the edges around her shivering legs. He sat back on his side of the carriage. Beatrice sat perfectly still. The heat from the pan seeped into her bones. The heavy wool of his cloak smelled intensely of him. Cedar, rain, and a faint, masculine musk. It was the warmest she had been in weeks. She closed her eyes, fighting a sudden, treacherous wave of tears. It was so much easier to hate him when he was cruel. This calculated, pragmatic care was terrifying. Marble pillars framed the entrance of Westford House, like the jaws of a stone leviathan. The carriage rolled to a halt under a massive portico, finally shielding them from the relentless rain. The heavy oak doors swung open before the footman even reached the steps, spilling warm, golden light onto the wet gravel. Arthur stepped out first. He turned, offering his hand. Beatrice ignored it. She clutched his cloak around her shoulders, holding her canvas satchel like a shield, and awkwardly descended the iron steps in her stocking feet. The gravel bit into her soles. She bit her lip, forcing herself to walk past him, limping up the wide stone stairs and into the grand foyer. The heat inside hit her like a physical wall. It smelled of beeswax, lemon polish and wood smoke. A massive crystal chandelier hung from a vaulted ceiling, casting a blinding light that made her wince. Servants lined the hall, heads bowed. They were impeccably dressed, silent, and entirely intimidating. A severe-looking woman in a stark black dress and a ring of keys at her waist stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp. She barely glanced at Beatrice, though her eyes undeniably registered the dripping hair, the bruised face, and the muddy stockings. "Mrs. Croft," Arthur said, shedding his damp coat and handing it to a waiting butler. "Miss Hale will be occupying the blue guest suite. She requires a hot bath immediately. Have a tray of food sent up. Broth, bread, nothing rich. Her stomach won't handle it. and send for Dr. Evans to examine her knee. I don't need a doctor, Beatrice croaked. Her voice sounded thin, echoing pathetically in the cavernous space. Arthur ignored her completely. Have her wet clothes burned. Find something suitable for her to sleep in. I will speak with her in the morning. He didn't look back at her. He turned and walked down a long corridor, disappearing behind a pair of heavy mahogany doors. Just like that, the transaction was concluded for the night. The asset had been delivered and handed off for processing. Mrs. Croft turned to Beatrice. Her expression softened, just a fraction. Come with me, miss. The climb up the sweeping grand staircase was agonizing. By the time they reached the second floor, Beatrice was leaning heavily on the banister, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The blue suite was larger than the entire floor of her boarding house. A fire already blazed in the hearth. A brass tub sat in the center of an adjoining bathing room, and two maids were rushing back and forth with buckets of steaming water. Take off the wet things, Mrs. Croft ordered gently. Beatrice stood frozen. The sheer luxury of the room was suffocating. The velvet curtains, the silk wallpaper, the enormous bed with its mountain of pillows. It felt like a trap baited with absolute comfort. She let Arthur's cloak slide from her shoulders. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Her stiff, numb fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress. The wet fabric clung stubbornly to her skin. A maid stepped forward to help, peeling the ruined dress and petticoats away until Beatrice stood, shivering in a threadbare chemise. In the water, miss, Mrs. Croft urged. Beatrice stepped into the tub. The heat of the water was a shock to her system. It stung her frozen skin, 1,000 tiny needles prickling her flesh. She sank down until the water reached her chin. The scent of harsh carbolic soap and dried rosemary filled the steam. She closed her eyes, the exhaustion finally pulling her under. For 20 minutes, she simply existed in the heat. A maid gently washed her hair, untangling the wet knots. Another scrubbed at her hands, trying to remove the stubborn black ink stained deep into her cuticles. Leave it, Beatrice muttered, pulling her hands away. You won't get it out. It's printer's ink. It stays. The maid looked to Mrs. Croft, who gave a slight nod. They left her hands alone. Once out of the tub, she was dried with towels thicker than any blanket she had ever owned, and slipped into a nightgown of heavy, ivory silk. It slid over her bruised, bony shoulders like water. She sat in a plush armchair by the fire as a footman brought in a silver tray, a bowl of steaming chicken broth, a thick slice of fresh, crusty bread, a cup of sweet tea. Beatrice stared at the food. Her stomach cramped violently, a hollow, desperate ache. She picked up the spoon. Her hand shook so badly the broth spilled before it reached her mouth. She dropped the spoon with a clatter, picked up the bowl with both hands, and drank directly from the rim. The rich, salty liquid hit her empty stomach like a stone. It was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. She tore off a piece of bread and shoved it into her mouth, chewing frantically. Slowly, miss, Mrs. Croft warned from the doorway. If you eat too fast after starving, it will come right back up. Beatrice ignored her. She swallowed the bread. A heavy, nauseating wave immediately rolled through her gut. She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth, breathing through her nose until the spasm passed. Mrs. Croft was right. Her body was broken. She had to pace herself. She set the bowl down, leaning back in the chair. The firelight danced on the silk of her nightgown. She was warm. She was full. She was clean. Downstairs, Arthur sat in his study. The ledgers were open on his desk, but he hadn't written a single number. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the crystal clinking sharply in the quiet room. He stared into the amber liquid. He had secured his wife. His uncle's estate was safe. The transaction was complete. He took a sip. The whiskey burned his throat. He thought of her sitting in his carriage, shivering under his cloak, her wet, ruined toes resting on the brass pan. He thought of the fierce, trapped look in her eyes. He had bought her. He owned her debts, and by extension, her life. Arthur set the glass down with a sharp crack against the mahogany. He felt a sudden, aggressive urge to go upstairs, to open the door to the blue suite and prove to himself that she was just an asset, just a variable. But as he looked at the dark hallway, the Duke of Westford realized, with a cold, sinking feeling, that he was terrified of what he would feel if he saw her asleep under his roof. Sunlight felt aggressive. It pierced the gap in the heavy velvet drapes, a sharp, brilliant beam that struck Beatrice directly across the eyes. She groaned, trying to turn over, but her body instantly rebelled. Her right knee screamed, a hot, stabbing pain that radiated up to her hip and down to her ankle. She gasped, falling back against the mountain of goose-down pillows. Waking up in Westford House was a sensory shock. The mattress was so thick, she felt as if she were sinking into quicksand. The linens smelled faintly of lavender and fresh air, a jarring contrast to the damp decay she had inhaled for the last 6 months. For 3 long seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory of the brass warming pan, the destroyed contract, and Arthur Pendleton's cold, absolute ultimatum came crashing down on her chest. She threw off the heavy silk quilt. Her breath hitched. The bruised knee was swollen to the size of a melon, the skin mottled with ugly shades of violet, yellow and angry red. A soft knock interrupted her inspection. Before she could speak, the door opened. Mrs. Croft entered, carrying a silver tray laden with a teapot, a porcelain cup, and a small, folded linen towel. Behind her walked a man with a worn leather medical bag. He smelled strongly of peppermint and iodine. "Good morning, miss," Mrs. Croft said, her tone professional, setting the tray on the bedside table. "This is Dr. Evans. His Grace requested he look at that leg before you attempt to walk." Beatrice pulled the silk nightgown down over her knee, her jaw tightening. "I did not ask for a physician." "I am aware," a deep voice cut in from the hallway. Arthur strode into the room. He was dressed flawlessly in a charcoal morning suit, his cravat tied with geometric precision. He carried no ledger this morning, but his eyes were just as calculating. He brought a cold, restless energy into the warm bedroom, instantly shrinking the vast space. "Examine her, doctor," Arthur commanded, stopping at the foot of the bed. He crossed his arms. He didn't look away when Beatrice glared at him. Dr. Evans approached with a gentle, apologetic smile. He peeled back the silk hem. He probed the swollen joint with cool, practiced fingers. Beatrice flinched, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted the sharp tang of copper. She refused to make a sound. She kept her eyes locked on Arthur, a silent, vicious challenge. Arthur held her gaze. He saw the white-knuckled grip she had on the bedsheets. He saw the pulse fluttering wildly at the base of her throat. She looked terrifyingly fragile in the massive bed, swallowed by white linens and ivory silk, yet her eyes burned with a defiance that made a mockery of her physical state. "No fracture, Your Grace," Dr. Evans finally announced, packing a jar of arnica salve back into his bag. "A severe contusion and a strained ligament. She needs absolute rest for a week. Ice it twice a day and keep it elevated." "Thank you, Doctor," Arthur said. "Mrs. Croft will see you out." The housekeeper and the physician exited, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The click of the latch sounded incredibly loud. They were alone. The silence stretched, thick with unresolved violence from the night before. Beatrice pulled her knees to her chest. wincing as the injured joint protested, and wrapped her arms around her legs. It was a defensive posture, a barrier of bone and silk between her and the Duke. "Did you sleep well, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. "Did your ledgers balance to your satisfaction?" Arthur slowly walked around the bed, stopping near the window. He looked out at the London skyline, blurred by the morning fog. "You are angry." "I am a prisoner," she corrected. "Anger requires a level of autonomy I no longer possess." "You are not a prisoner. You are in the finest guest suite of my home. You have been fed, treated by a top physician, and you are no longer hunted by thugs." He turned to face her. "Most people would call that a rescue. Most people do not understand the cost of your rescues." She rubbed her thumb over the deep, permanent ink stain on her index finger. "What happens today, Arthur? Do I get a leash, or simply a collar with your crest?" Hearing his Christian name in her mouth sent a strange, uncomfortable jolt through his ribs. It wasn't the deferential murmur of his peers. It was a weapon, stripped of titles and pretense. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat. He withdrew a single sheet of paper. It wasn't the thick, ostentatious vellum from last night. It was standard, utilitarian legal paper, covered in tight, precise handwriting. "I had my solicitor at my desk at 6 o'clock this morning," Arthur said, holding the paper loosely at his side. "This is not the contract you destroyed. This is a simple acknowledgement of debt, £462. It states that I have assumed your liabilities." Beatrice stopped breathing. She stared at the paper. "If you sign this," Arthur continued, his voice devoid of inflection, "you acknowledge the debt is owed to me. I will give you a schedule of repayment. You will leave this house, return to whatever slum you can afford, and pay me back over the next 10 years at a standard interest rate." He took a step closer, holding the paper out. "Or," he said softly, "you can marry me on Saturday. The debt is eradicated. You never see Fisk again. You never freeze again." Beatrice looked at the utilitarian paper. It was an exit, a heavy, suffocating exit that would chain her to poverty for a decade. But it was an exit. She looked up at Arthur. His face was entirely unreadable. He wasn't demanding. He was waiting. She reached out, her fingers brushing the stiff paper. The paper felt coarse against her thumb. Beatrice stared at the neat columns of ink. 10 years. 10 years of scraping together pennies, of skipping meals, of freezing in unheated rooms, all to hand her meagre earnings to a man who spent £400 on a single horse. She looked at the bruised, swollen mass of her knee. She wouldn't be able to stand at a printing press for weeks. She had no shop. She had no clients left. If she took this debt acknowledgement, she would default by the 1st of the month. He knew that. It wasn't a choice. It was an illusion of choice designed to make her surrender feel voluntary. "Where is the marriage contract?" she asked. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. Arthur's jaw tightened. He didn't smile in triumph. He simply returned the utilitarian paper to his pocket and withdrew a different document. This one was 3 pages long, bound with a discreet blue ribbon. He laid it on the edge of the mattress, next to her injured leg. He produced a fountain pen, unscrewing the cap with a quiet scrape of metal. Beatrice didn't look at the document immediately. She looked at the silver tray on the bedside table. The smell of the tea was sweet and inviting. She felt a profound, overwhelming wave of self-disgust. She was selling herself for a warm bed and a cup of tea. She picked up the pages. Her eyes skimmed the dense legal jargon. Allowances, properties, dowager clauses. It was a flawless cage. "I have a condition," she said quietly. Arthur's eyebrow twitched. "You are not in a position to dictate conditions, Beatrice. I am trading my life for your convenience, she snapped, the fire suddenly returning to her eyes, bright and desperate. I will sign your paper. I will stand in your church. I will smile at your insufferable peers, but I keep my press. Arthur stared at her. Your press was seized. You bought my debts. You hold the mortgage on my equipment. Release the padlock. Move the press from the bank's warehouse to a property in my name. She leaned forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in her leg. It belonged to my father. It is mine. You will be the Duchess of Westford, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. My wife does not operate a printing press like a common tradesman. Your wife, she spat the word, is a bankrupt printer you bought out of a gutter. Do not pretend you are marrying a delicate flower. I want the press, Arthur. I want a building to house it. If you want a docile, empty-headed aristocrat, go find one. If you want me to sign this contract, you give me my press. The silence in the room was absolute. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour, a distant, mocking sound. Arthur looked at her hands. The ink stains on her cuticles were dark and stubborn. He realized then that she wasn't asking for a hobby. She was asking for an anchor, a piece of her identity to hold on to while he consumed the rest of her life. He felt that strange, irritating pressure in his chest again. It felt dangerously close to respect. He didn't speak. He reached out and took the contract from her hands. Beatrice's stomach plummeted. She had pushed too hard. He was going to withdraw the offer. He was going to throw her back into the street. Arthur laid the contract flat on the bedside table, right next to the teapot. He leaned over it, uncapped his fountain pen, and began to write directly onto the pristine margins of the final page. The gold nib scratched violently against the paper. He didn't use formal legal language. He wrote in sharp, aggressive strokes. The printing press, formerly housed at Miller's Court, along with all associated type and equipment, is hereby transferred entirely to the sole ownership of Beatrice Hale. A suitable commercial property will be purchased and deeded in her name within 30 days of the marriage ceremony. He straightened up. He had ruined the aesthetic perfection of the legal document. He turned the contract around and pushed it toward her, offering her the pen. "Sign it," he commanded. His voice wasn't flat anymore. It carried a raw, abrasive edge. Beatrice took the pen. The metal casing was still warm from his grip. She looked down at his messy, commanding handwriting, disrupting the neat legal text. He had given in. It was a tiny victory, a microscopic concession in the grand scheme of her surrender. But it was hers. She rested the nib against the bottom line. Her hand trembled. She thought of the cold rain. She thought of the smell of boiled cabbage. She pressed down. Beatrice Hale. The ink bled slightly into the thick paper. She didn't hand the pen back. She dropped it on the tray. It clattered against the porcelain teacup. Arthur picked up the contract. He stared at her signature for a long moment. He carefully folded the document, sliding it into his interior pocket. The transaction was complete. The uncle's inheritance was safe. He had his asset. So why did he feel like he had just lost a war? "A dressmaker will arrive at noon," Arthur said, turning toward the door. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion once again. "The ceremony is Saturday at St. George's. I expect you to be healed enough to walk down the aisle without a cane. A limping bride invites unnecessary questions." "I will walk perfectly, Your Grace," Beatrice said to his back. "I wouldn't want to damage your investment." Arthur's hand paused on the brass doorknob. He didn't look back. He simply opened the door and walked out, leaving Beatrice alone in the vast, quiet room to listen to the heavy, final thud of the latch locking her inside her new life. Corset bone dug viciously into Beatrice's lower ribs. Two maids pulled the silk lacings with a rhythmic, impersonal brutality, trapping the air in the upper half of her lungs. She gripped the edge of the mahogany vanity, watching her knuckles turn white in the mirror. Her reflection looked like a stranger. The bruised, hollow-eyed printer from Miller's Court had been erased, buried under 40 yards of ivory Duchess satin and an obscene amount of Belgian lace. Her hair, washed with lavender soap until it squeaked, was pinned up in a heavy, painful architecture. She smelled of orange blossoms and expensive French powder, a cloying, suffocating scent meant to mask the smell of poverty she felt was permanently etched into her pores. "Breathe in, Your Grace," the head modiste ordered, around a mouthful of brass pins. "I cannot," Beatrice gasped. "Perfection requires a slight restriction of the lungs," the woman hummed, tying off the laces with a sharp jerk. Beatrice closed her eyes. Her right knee, bound tightly in linen and rigid splints beneath the crinoline, throbbed in time with her racing heart. It was Saturday. 4 days of hot baths, rich beef broths, and total isolation in the blue suite had healed the worst of the bruising, but the joint still felt like ground glass when she put weight on it. She refused the mahogany cane Arthur had sent up that morning. She would not limp. She would not give the aristocrats packing street. George's a single reason to pity her. She was a transaction, yes, but she would be a flawless one. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows of the church, casting fractured, bleeding colours across the cold stone floor. St. George's smelled of ancient dust, damp wool from the attendees' coats, and the heavy, waxy smoke of 100 beeswax candles. A low, buzzing murmur filled the vaulted ceiling, the sound of London's elite whispering behind gloved hands. They had come to see the Duke's sudden, scandalously fast wedding to a nobody. Beatrice stood in the narthex. No father to walk her down the aisle, no bridesmaids, just Mrs. Croft standing 2 paces behind, holding the heavy satin train. The organ groaned, a deep, vibrating chord that rattled Beatrice's teeth. The heavy oak doors swung open. The sea of faces turned. Hundreds of eyes, sharp and hungry, locked onto her. She looked straight ahead. Arthur stood at the altar. He wore stark black evening dress, the cut so precise it looked forged from iron rather than tailored from cloth. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not look like a man greeting his bride. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. Beatrice stepped forward. Pain shot up her right leg, sharp and blinding. She swallowed a gasp, forcing her heel down, locking her jaw. Step, step, keep the rhythm. The satin rustled loudly, hiding the slight drag of her foot. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on Arthur's slate-grey gaze. As she drew closer, she saw the tension corded in his neck. He was watching her walk, his eyes dropping to her hemline, tracking the slight, unnatural stiffness in her gait. He knew the agony it was costing her. A muscle leaped in his jaw, but he didn't step forward to assist her. He let her fight the distance alone, honouring the stubborn, self-destructive pride she had demanded he respect. She reached the altar, stopping inches from him. Her chest heaved against the restrictive corset. She tasted copper. "You made it," Arthur murmured, his voice so low it was swallowed by the vicar's opening prayer. "I said I wouldn't limp," she whispered back, staring straight ahead at the gold cross. "I would have caught you. I would have dragged you down with me." The vicar cleared his throat, glaring over his spectacles. The ceremony was a blur of ancient Latin, incense, and droning obligations. Beatrice felt completely disconnected from her own body. She was watching the proceedings from a distance, a ghost haunting her own wedding. Then the vicar prompted the ring. Arthur turned to her. He reached out, taking her left hand. His fingers were incredibly warm against her icy skin. He didn't rush. He looked down at her hand, his thumb brushing over the dark, permanent ink stain on her index finger. It was a jarring contrast, his immaculate, manicured grip holding her rough, working-class hand. He didn't try to hide the stain from the vicar or the front row of peers. He slid a heavy band of raw, brushed gold onto her finger. It was cold and weighty, a shackle, a promise. "With this ring I thee wed," Arthur said. His voice didn't waver. It was a concrete fact, dropping into the silent church like a stone. "With this ring," Beatrice repeated, her voice cracking slightly on the final syllable. It was done. They walked back down the aisle together. Arthur's hand rested on the small of her back, the heat of his palm burning through the thick satin of her gown. He was steering her, a subtle, possessive pressure that made her stomach tighten. The sea of faces blurred. The whispers grew louder. She didn't care. She just wanted to sit down before her knee gave out entirely. The carriage ride back to Westford House was suffocatingly quiet. The rain beat a frantic rhythm against the roof. Beatrice slumped against the velvet squabs, instantly reaching down to unlace the top eyelets of her boots beneath her skirts. She hissed through her teeth as the pressure released. Arthur sat opposite her, watching. He reached up and loosened his silk cravat, destroying the geometric perfection. The tension that had held him rigid at the altar seemed to bleed out of him, replaced by a heavy, exhausted slump. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was pale, her lips bitten raw. The absurdly expensive dress looked like armor she was desperate to shed. "We survived the vultures," Arthur said, his voice flat. "You purchased me," Beatrice replied, leaning her head back against the carriage wall, closing her eyes. "You deal with the vultures. That is the arrangement." "Yes," he agreed softly. "That is the arrangement." He stared at the gold band on her finger. She had demanded her press. She had fought his money. She had walked down the aisle on a shredded knee just to deny him the satisfaction of seeing her weak. Arthur Pendleton realized then, with a dark, terrifying clarity, that he hadn't just bought a convenient wife. He had invited a wildfire into his meticulously ordered life, and he had absolutely no idea how to contain it. He didn't want to contain it. The carriage hit a cobblestone rut. Beatrice jolted, her injured knee bumping the seat. She gasped, her eyes flying open. Before she could steady herself, Arthur moved. He crossed the small space, sitting directly beside her. He didn't ask permission. He simply reached down, lifted her legs, and arranged them carefully across his lap, taking the weight off the bruised joint. Beatrice froze, her breath catching in her throat. The heat of his thighs seeped through her satin skirts. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Protecting my investment, Duchess," Arthur murmured, looking out the window into the driving rain. His hand rested lightly over her ankle, a warm, heavy weight. "Try to rest. The war has just begun." And so, the ink-stained printer officially becomes the Duchess of Westford. Their vows were a cold exchange of terms, but the heavy tension in that carriage proves that neither Beatrice nor Arthur truly knows what they've signed up for. Can a marriage built on blackmail, fierce pride, and unspoken fascination survive the snake pit of London high society? Or will their clashing wills burn Westford House to the ground? If you felt the heat of that final scene, smash the like button and share this story with a fellow historical romance lover. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you won't miss the explosive next chapter of Beatrice and Arthur's turbulent marriage.